Hello everyone, this is Bobbin Threadbare and welcome back to Threadbare Reviews. Today's topic is another Bobbin's Choice, courtesy of patron ASDF JKLSC, and so I've chosen a relatively obscure film entitled MirrorMask. The movie first came to theaters in 2005. The story about the story. In the year 1990, the famous puppeteer Jim Henson died very suddenly of a bacterial infection. Because of that, the Jim Henson Company he built around his Muppets franchise was basically set adrift, with no real idea of what to do with themselves. Henson had been in talks with Disney to buy the company, but the merger was dropped a few months after his death, and Disney and Henson's kids couldn't reach a deal. Disney would eventually buy the rights to the Muppets IP from the company, but, at least at the moment, the Jim Henson Company itself and the rest of its properties are still independent. There was a brief stretch from 2000 to 2003 when the company was owned by a German media company called EM.TV, but then the Henson family bought the company back, and today they are the sole owners. The idea for MirrorMask began before the sale in 1999. That was the year that Labyrinth and the Dark Crystal were first released on DVD, and they were doing so well in sales that Sony Pictures came up with the idea of producing a third film, something to expand the library of Jim Henson Company fantasy films. They first thought of making sequels or prequels to the existing films, but eventually they decided to make something standalone, which was nevertheless in the same style as the other two. In 2001, Lisa Henson approached writer Neil Gaiman, who was working on American Gods at the time, and illustrator Dave McKean, who was just starting to branch out from comic book art and into directing short films. The two knew each other because McKean drew all the covers for Gaiman's famous Sandman run, and they were essentially recruited as a package deal. In early 2002, both men spent a few weeks at the Henson family home and knocked out a script, but production would take a year and a half, thanks to all of the sets and animation required. The rest of the cast and crew would be just as British as the writer and director. Because of a tight budget, just about everyone on the project was new, obscure, or only locally famous, and any exceptions to that either became more famous later, or else only showed up in a cameo. MirrorMask was eventually released in 2005. It was mostly a direct-to-DVD film, but it got a limited run in theaters, probably for tax reasons or award qualifications or some such. As such, while the movie only cost $4 million to make, it only earned $867,000 at the box office. Critical reception to the film was mixed, with most critics praising the visual aspects of the movie, but being less enthusiastic about the plot and pacing. But then, that's basically what they said about Labyrinth and the Dark Crystal. And while MirrorMask hasn't reached the same level of cult status as those other two films, it does have its fans, and I count myself among them. And now that my bias is firmly established, let's get into the details. The review. Helena Campbell is the teenage daughter of Morris and Joanne, a married couple who own a circus that tours the United Kingdom. And I should specify that this is a modern circus, so no animals and no sideshows, just people who perform their unusual skills for an audience. Helena is unhappy with the way her mother guilts her into performing in the family circus, but then she's also unhappy when her mother collapses just after a performance. On the night before her mother goes in for an operation, Helena slips into a fantasy world based on the drawings she covers her walls with. She meets a juggler named Valentine who helps her get around, and she discovers that the Queen of Light has slipped into a coma while the Queen of Darkness is slowly consuming the landscape. Helena eventually discovers that the Queen of Darkness's daughter, who looks just like her, has stolen the mirror mask that balances light and darkness and used it to swap places with Helena in the real world. Helena is eventually betrayed by Valentine for the Queen of Darkness's reward money, and she then gets brainwashed into being her good little daughter. But eventually, Valentine regrets his actions and returns to help her get her mind back, and then to retrieve the mirror mask. In the end, Helena returns to the real world, her mother recovers, and valuable lessons are learned. First off, I have to say that MirrorMask's visuals have aged surprisingly well for being a largely CGI film made in the early 2000s on a shoestring budget. Most of the computer-generated creatures are abstract exaggerations rather than detailed models. And this was a deliberate choice because of the small budget. And yet because of this choice, the janky movements and rough textures are a perfect fit for the film's art design. Now, with that being said, there are aspects of the visuals that I didn't find appealing. When the fantasy sequence kicks in, the film takes on such a heavy sepia filter that it almost becomes monochromatic. Admittedly, MirrorMask does more with its limited color palette than a lot of other early 2000s movies, but I still would have preferred a more vibrant spectrum than what the film offers. As for the acting, it's remarkably good considering the budget. Some scenes and some actors are certainly more nuanced than others, but then over-dramatic acting is exactly what you want in a surrealist fantasy. And the characters certainly seem real enough during the real-world sequences, and so I have no complaints about it. Regarding the plot, I think I can see why some critics didn't enjoy it. The story follows a fairly traditional hero's journey format, and by traditional, I mean that the protagonist journeys through a largely unrelated series of challenges. Helena escapes a consuming darkness, gets her quest from the Light Queen's Prime Minister, visits a weird cat lady, visits a library, visits a couple of floating giants, and only after all of that does she have an encounter with any real symbolic meaning. But me? I'm a fan of old myths and legends, and so this episodic format doesn't bother me. And if it doesn't bother you, then I highly recommend you watch this film. The analysis. Oh, mama. There's plenty of red meat to chew on with this one. But to cut straight to the heart of the matter, MirrorMask is a film about the relationship between a mother and her newly grown-up daughter. Joanne is still used to seeing her daughter as a little girl who can't make informed, intelligent decisions about her life. And meanwhile, Helena is still used to seeing her parents as people who have everything figured out and can't understand her conflicting opinions and need for independence. That's why the movie centers on masks. Everyone wears a mask, the face and personality they put on for their family or their friends or the world at large. The Dark Queen, the evil version of Joanne, wants Helena to put on the mask she chooses for her, to play the role of the good, obedient daughter, and she doesn't really care who the girl is beneath the mask. And this causes her daughter to rebel, to become Dark Helena, a version of herself who disrespects her father, smokes cigarettes, makes out with random boys, and burns the drawings she worked so hard to create. In general, one of the last things that children realize just before they grow up is that their parents or guardians are fallible. Their parents are emotional, they get angry, they get bored, they make mistakes, and they cope with their own unique set of mental problems as they attempt to appear without ever actually being normal. And that's something Helena learns over the course of the movie. While she should stand up for herself and her right to determine her own future, she also needs to understand that her parents are only human, and they don't always make the best decisions or know exactly how the future will turn out. Not only does this knowledge help Helena understand her parents, it also helps her realize that she doesn't always have to listen to them. Of course, Joanne has to learn a lesson too about her daughter being fully grown up, and the movie does address this at one point. As Helena travels through the dream realm that separates the light and dark realms, she meets her mother, her real mother, who is also in the middle of a dream. They take a moment to connect and admit things to each other that they wouldn't admit if they were both awake. Sadly, there is a missed opportunity, however, since we never see Helena and Joanne talk to each other after Helena returns to the real world. Another running theme is the importance of an apology. At the start of the movie, Helena says some very hurtful things to her mother, and she never fully apologizes for saying them during the lead-up to the surgery. This is reflected in the fact that her companion in the dream realm, Valentine, also refuses to apologize to his tower, and because of that, the two are not on speaking terms. In the end, though, she convinces Valentine to apologize. Not for being wrong, mind you, but for having the argument. Because even if you disagree with someone about a very important topic, you shouldn't let a single argument ruin your relationship with that person. Thanks for joining me again for today's Threadbare review, and I hope I'll see you next time. Until then, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and if you have extra money to spare, you can support me on Patreon. Link in the description.